Vayigash elav Yehuda, Vayomer bi Adoni, Yedaber no avdecha davar beoznei Adoni, V'al yichar aptecha biavdecha, Ki chamocha ki far'o, Adoni sha'al es avadav leimor, Hayesh lachem av o ach.
This week's Torah portion is called Vayigash. Very appropriate title. It starts with Genesis 44, verse 18. Then Judah approached him and said, Vayigash, this action of approaching refers to Judah. Again, two brothers, once highlighted in the previous Torah portions, come back together, but from a different perspective. Now, Judah, the youngest of the four brothers who were born by Leah at first, after the marriage with Jacob, who is much older, nevertheless, than Joseph. Now he approaches his younger brother. Oh, very unusual, even in today's world. But this paradox is highlighting the change which is Judah experiencing in his life. While that famine, which we talked about in the previous Torah portion, which was catastrophic in its nature, really affected the family of Jacob. We read in this Torah portion that in chapter 47 that the famine was very severe, and as a result of that famine and the government of Egypt preparedness to ride it out for 7 years, the entire Egypt became the property of Pharaoh. In other words, Joseph was really instrumental to the Hyksos dynasty to actually solidify its grip and its power on Egypt, because economically now all Egyptians were dependent upon the Pharaoh and the supply of food which they had in the Pharaoh's storehouse. And in order to get the loans, to get the food, to let them get through the year, they had to put their property, their land, as a collateral. And in fact, the structure of the property has changed in Egypt drastically, in such a way that no longer Egyptians were owners of their land, even though they kept paying the same 1/5 of their income as a taxes, but the land no longer belonged to them. They became renters, not the owners, which of course improved and kept improving the attitude of the Pharaoh toward Joseph. But Joseph had his own struggles, and Jacob's family had its own struggles. Some scholars describe this famine based on the documents found that this was one of the worst ever existed in the world. The cannibalism usually in this case becomes rampant. And of course, the property of Jacob, the main assets of his family, the sheep and the goat, they definitely could not survive such an ordeal. Definitely the value really started going down, and the situation became sour. Unfortunately, our human nature is such that we need a certain suffering to really acknowledge our need and dependence on God. Joseph went through sufferings in order for himself to become a mature man of God, to live behind his child's boasting, his dreams, and become a man who lives with God and walks with him daily. The turn of Judah also came. They came to Egypt once, and something wasn't right. And Judah, who was the one who actually sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, he was the one whose conscience didn't give him rest. He talked with his brothers and said, maybe it is happening to us because we sold our brother to that captivity. The situation was going really bad because, having no idea who this man of Egypt was, who kept suspecting them as the Babylonian or Hittite spies, especially this was logical because it became apparent that the situation, the economic downturn is really all across the well-known ancient Middle Eastern world. And the economic downturn actually is one of the good catalysts of wars. If one country doesn't have enough food, it would probably go start a desperate action to try to break through the problem, break free of this problem by capturing another country. This is, for example, well known in the time of medieval Europe, when Vikings were roaming around all Europe and created a kingdom in the south of Sicily and in France and in England, and for the very simple reason, the Scandinavian land was not fruitful enough to support the population, and these people were desperate. This is why the questions which the Prime Minister of Egypt asked the children of Jacob were very much legitimate. Did you come to really ask for the food? Or did you come because the rumors are that we do have some food and you come to buy it from us just to tell our enemies that there is a food in here and this country can be conquered and this food reserves can be taken and used? This was a legitimate question. But of course, behind that legitimate question was Joseph's curiosity about his own family from the two perspectives. Of course, he was worried about his younger brother Benjamin, because he knew that the situation didn't change. Both he and Benjamin were the children of the beloved Rachel. Did Benjamin get the same treatment as I did? That was a concern of Joseph. Of course it was. But the second, he wanted to hear what was happening from the mouth of his offenders. And that's why he was concerned. He was covering this up by some suspicions, legitimately looking questions, but he was trying to find out, who are you today? Where do you stand? This is why finally, when Joseph sees Benjamin and wants to take him captive, Judah is broken. Well, what they did many years ago, they really didn't expect to see the father's reaction like this. Sometimes the action which from somebody's mind seems to be harmless can really reap bad consequences. When I was a kid, I liked to play like this with my parents and my family. I was youngest in the family, and often we would be somewhere and I couldn't participate in these conversations with adults. And I was bored, and the way I did it, when we would go around the park, I would run ahead, hide behind the trees, and later on my parents would pass, and I would jump at them from behind, just trying to scare them. Of course, not to scare, but to turn attention to myself. So one day, we were in the Black Sea, away from home, just in the hotel, and we went to see some movie, and we were going back, just walking to our hotel, and we needed to take a bus eventually to get to the hotel. So I decided to play my woof trick, and I ran and I hid behind the corner of the building, and I waited. Somehow, to my amusement and amazement, but the parents didn't show up behind the corner. I waited for about 40 minutes, and I was surprised that my parents weren't there. Something was really wrong. Maybe I've chosen the wrong turn, and they didn't turn there. I knew how to get to the hotel, so I just ran to the bus stop, took the bus, and in about another 30 minutes, I was at the hotel. To my shock, I saw how my mother is taking a nitroglycerin. What in the world happened? What have I done? Well, I realized what happened. Because when I disappeared from my mother's sight, and I was 10 years old, she kind of already knew about my tricks. She didn't pay attention. But suddenly, into her sight came a little bit different picture. She saw a boy that my complexion and my height and my build standing at the sidewalk of the busy intersection and waving at the cars, and she saw a car pulling toward the boy, and the boy getting into the car. That what brought her to shock. She thought it was me. And when they came to the hotel, they alerted police, and everybody was looking for me. They almost started the Amber Alert. Well, the same thing happened with the brothers of Joseph when they just took his clothes and took the blood of the goat and pretended that the wild beast killed the boy. It shattered Jacob so much they really didn't expect. And that's what started to work upon the heart of Judah for many years. And that's why Judah approaches Joseph by telling his side of the story, and Joseph hears a different man. A repentant man, a man who is burdened by guilt of what he has done to his brother and to his father. And that's what brings reconciliation. That's why we today, who are hurt, want to hear the story. when somebody who hurt us come, we want to hear the story. We want to hear now what happened. How does this individual see himself or herself today? How does he evaluate or she evaluate what happened? And when Joseph hears Yehuda's self-evaluation, he breaks up in tears because he doesn't have anger. He has forgiven his brothers, but he needs closure. This is a strong story, psychological melodrama, described even in many books and movies. But it shows what many authors have really missed. It demonstrates the conversion experience of Judah, when Yehuda really comes to the Lord close in this situation. Well, as I said, we often need to be shaken up in order to come to the Lord. But the providence of God always works in our favor. And Joseph, even though he went through the slavery, he was sold as a slave, then he ended up in prison, he's not bitter with God. He doesn't have bitter experience because seeing what is going on around the world, he realizes that God sent him there specifically and providentially to save his family. This is why in chapter 45, verse 5, he says, "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." This God's providence has a second dimension. God wanted to preserve the people of God, not only physically, but spiritually. God gave to Abraham a command to come and settle in the land of Canaan. God expected that piece of land become a center for his light. Jacob followed the footsteps of his grandfather, but his children particularly failed the mission. The treacherous behavior at Shechem put the perspective of peaceful acquisition of the land out of the picture. Another example with Judah has demonstrated that children of Jacob has not matured spiritually, and whatever they do in this land only turns the people of Canaan away from the Lord and toward more and more bitter pagan worship. This is why God told Abraham in Genesis 15 that I will return your people from Egypt when the iniquity of the Canaanites will be fulfilled. Well, unfortunately, instead of helping to stop the spread of that iniquity, children of Israel were helping this iniquity to flourish by adding toward this, by destroying the trust. And this is why God needed to pull them away. An entire family of almost 70 people moves to Egypt with Jacob as the head. In verse 47, we see a moving experience, Jacob meeting Pharaoh. Yes, on the one hand, in Canaan, family of Jacob did not meet the expectation of God. But by the providence of God in Egypt, they really impacted the Pharaoh and sort of corrected what was done at the time of Abraham by Abraham. Pharaoh meets Jacob and talks with him. Pharaoh, who already himself experienced the power of God by having Joseph as God's representative ruling the country, and Pharaoh, trusts Joseph completely. So he's wondering how the father of this man looks. So he talks to Pharaoh. Pharaoh talks to Jacob and asks him, "How many years have you lived?" Verse 8 of chapter 47. And Jacob says to Pharaoh, "The years of my sojourning are 130. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life, nor they have attained the years of that my fathers lived during the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. When Rashi comments this verse 10, he indicates that, of course, Jacob reads to the Pharaoh the blessing from the Lord. He has no power to bless, but his God, God of Jacob, God of Isaac, God of Abraham, has the power to bless Pharaoh. And the ruling of this Pharaoh was prosperous. Jacob and his family come to a very, very good land. They are settled in the land of Goshen, which many sages believe was a very fruitful land right in the delta of Nile. In other words, Pharaoh is grateful to Joseph, and he gives the best land for the people of Israel. In fact, they ask for this land because this land in the delta, because it has so much swampy areas, even in such a drought, has sufficient amount of grass to feed what is left from Jacob's possession. With all the cattle, they had to survive for 2 years with no rain. And of course, this being in Goshen helps Israel to flourish and to multiply and to really turn into a big, rich nation. That was the providence of God. But this providence was only partial fulfillment. This is why rabbis take the Haftarah passage from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37. In that chapter, there are two visions. The vision of resurrection and the vision of return to Israel. The second vision is often used by many evangelicals to indicate the return of Israel as a distinct sign of the last day events. And they point out to today's Israel and say, this prophecy of Ezekiel 37 is being fulfilled. But let us look at this prophecy more careful, and we will see that it goes beyond today Israel. Chapter 37, verse 22 says, "And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king will be king for all of them, and they will no longer be two nations, and no longer be divided into two kingdoms." Ezekiel definitely refers to the situation of division between the northern and the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel with 10 tribes and the kingdom of Judah. But then he continues, "They will no longer defile themselves with their idols or with their detestable things or with any of their transgression, but I will deliver them from their dwelling place in which they have sinned and will cleanse them." And look how the text develops. "My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. They will live on my land that I gave to Jacob my servant, which is your fathers lived, and they will live on it, they and their sons sons forever, and David my servant will be their prince." Well, during the time of Ezekiel, David was already dead for over 400 years. Definitely the sages and everybody see this chapter as talking about the son of David, the Messiah, somebody bigger than just the ordinary king. This is why that new kingdom is possible only when God cleanses people of Israel. In other words, it's bigger than just the land which God gave to Abraham. This is why Jacob is telling the Pharaoh, "Yes, I am just a sojourner of this land." Well, for many years, the people of Israel felt themselves as sojourners in the galut, in the exile, as it says today, because for many centuries they were deprived of their land. And that's why in the Middle Ages, at the end of the Passover Seder, the people of Israel would always wish to each other, "Lashana haba leYerushalayim," next year in Jerusalem. A couple years ago, I listened to a rabbi who represented the religious Zionist movement, who passionately talked about the Eretz Israel as being a part of God's plan to become a possession of people of Israel. And he even caused lots of applause. So powerful his speech was. But I had a question. And I asked the rabbi this question. I said, "Rabbi, please tell me, why today are you still wishing each other Lashana haba leYerushalayim, the next year in Jerusalem, why, while you are already in Jerusalem?" And he said, "This is not enough. This is not sufficient. This is only physical. We want something bigger. We want the Messianic kingdom. We want the spiritual Jerusalem, heavenly Jerusalem. That's why we still wish each other next year in the heavenly Jerusalem." Isn't it a great understanding which mysteriously coincides with what the book of Revelation says when we recommend that particular chapter, chapter 22, to be a part of this weekly readings, it says here, there will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and the Lamb will be on it, and his bondservants will serve him. This talks about the New Jerusalem, Jerusalem in which God will be the king forever and ever. And there will be no longer any night, and there will be no need of the light of the lamp nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illumine them, and they will reign forever and ever. That's the ultimate goal. That's the land which God will eventually give to everyone who has the experience of relations with him.